Silly tourist ignores the king's guard twice, cross prohibited. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the city seemed alive with history at every turn. The tourist had dreamt of this moment for months, to see Buckingham Palace, the grand home of the British monarchy. They couldn't wait to explore, snapping pictures, soaking in the culture, and maybe even meeting some fascinating people along the way. Armed with a camera and an enthusiastic spirit, they set off, walking briskly through the busy streets, marveling at the towering buildings and the crowds of people from all over the world. The thrill of being in London made everything feel like a grand adventure. The tourist was so caught up in the buzz of the city that they hardly noticed the surroundings. It wasn't long before they reached the grand gates of Buckingham Palace. Standing at the entrance, the massive gates seemed to glitter in the sunlight, and the palace itself towered behind them, its stone walls exuding power and history. The tourist could hardly believe they were standing in front of one of the most famous buildings in the world. This was a moment to remember. Without a second thought, the tourist pulled out their camera and began taking photos. They snapped pictures of the gates, the stone lions guarding the entrance, and even the royal flags flying proudly in the breeze. The palace loomed behind them like something out of a fairy tale, and the tourist smiled, thinking about how lucky they were to be there in that exact moment. As they turned to walk around the palace grounds, they came across a group of fellow tourists. Some were snapping selfies, others were posing for pictures, and a few were simply standing in awe just like the tourist. Among them, a few had also noticed something strange. A tall, serious-looking man standing still as a statue, right in front of the gates. He was dressed in a red uniform, wearing a black bearskin hat and holding a rifle. His posture was rigid, his eyes straight ahead, and there was an air of authority surrounding him. The tourist, still not fully understanding the significance of the scene, approached the group of people talking about the guard. They overheard a few comments about how this person was part of the king's guard, and they were supposed to stand motionless, protecting the palace. But the tourist didn't fully grasp the rules. They had seen it in movies, sure, but standing still in that intense heat for hours. It seemed a little silly. The guard didn't move, didn't blink, and didn't show any emotion at all. "Who's afraid of a man in a funny hat?" the tourists chuckled to themselves. They raised their camera, eager to get a good shot of the guard. They walked a little closer, not thinking twice about it. After all, this was a tourist attraction, wasn't it? Just another person to photograph, like a statue or a street performer. But this guard, unlike any performer in the street, didn't smile or wave. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. With their camera up, the tourist moved closer, now directly in front of the guard. The crowd around them seemed to buzz with excitement. Some were laughing, some were whispering, but the guard remained as still as ever, not acknowledging the curious onlookers in the slightest. The tourist took a few more photos, getting closer with each shot. They didn't notice how uncomfortable their actions were making those around them. Then, with a small grin, the tourist accidentally bumped into the guard's rifle. It wasn't a hard bump, but it was enough to make the guard shift his feet slightly, as if to brace himself. The tourist, unaware of how serious the situation was, laughed it off. "Oops, sorry," they said, not fully realizing that they had just crossed an invisible line. The guard didn't say anything. He didn't even look down at the tourist. Instead, he just straightened his back even more, if that was even possible, and kept his eyes fixed ahead. The tourist, still smiling and feeling perfectly safe, took one last photo before backing up to join the rest of the crowd. That was fun, they thought, still caught up in the excitement of their adventure, but the seriousness of the moment was completely lost on them. The guard's role wasn't to entertain or be part of a photo op. His presence was a symbol of authority, tradition, and duty, a duty that required unwavering discipline. But to the tourist, it was just another interesting sight to check off their list. As the tourist moved away, they didn't notice the slight change in the guard's posture. He had relaxed a bit, but his eyes were still forward, his mind likely focused on the important task he was trained to do. He had faced far more serious breaches of protocol than a tourist's accidental nudge, but that didn't make the behavior any less noteworthy. The tourists strolled away, already planning their next move in the city. They were headed to the London Eye, then maybe to Covent Garden, and perhaps they'd grab a bite to eat by the river. There was so much to see and do in London, and they couldn't wait to experience it all. Unbeknownst to the tourist, however, the moment they had just experienced had become a small part of the larger world of royal protocol. To the average visitor, the King's Guard was just a quirky part of the London landscape, but to those who respected the traditions of the British monarchy, the Guards were an essential symbol of London's history and strength. For the tourist, it was just another story to tell, a funny moment to laugh about with friends when they returned home. They were too wrapped up in the excitement of the moment to consider the significance of their actions, or how easily they had brushed off the importance of the King's Guard. But the Guard, as always, remained silent, unwavering and vigilant, guarding not just the palace but the timeless tradition of his duty. The tourist was back at Buckingham Palace just a few hours later. They had walked around the city, taken in the sights, and enjoyed the atmosphere of London, but they couldn't get enough of the Grand Palace. The famous changing of the guard ceremony had been on their mind all day, and they were eager to witness it firsthand. The moment they had seen earlier, with the silent guard standing so still, had made them even more curious. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before, and the idea of seeing the changing of the guard up close seemed like the perfect way to round off their day. As they approached the gates of the palace again, the crowd had started to gather. Some people were standing around, chatting with friends, while others were taking photos just like they had earlier. The atmosphere was buzzing with excitement, and the tourist could sense the anticipation in the air. They knew the changing of the guard happened at specific times, so they made sure to get there early to secure a good spot. The tourists around them were chatting in different languages, and there was a friendly buzz of energy. It was as though everyone had come together to experience this one iconic moment in the heart of London. The tourist, feeling adventurous, found a spot near the front of the crowd. It gave them the perfect view of the guards, who stood ready for the changeover. Looking around, the tourist once again saw the guard they had encountered earlier, standing at attention, perfectly still, almost blending into the surroundings. Their tall black bearskin hat towered over the crowd, and their bright red uniform stood out against the backdrop of the palace. The tourist's eyes lit up at the thought of getting a better picture. This time, they wanted to capture the ceremony itself, not just the stillness of the guard. They made their way through the crowd, weaving between people as they did their best to stay close to the front. They didn't really think twice about how close they were getting to the guards. It didn't occur to them that there were rules in place for a reason, that the guards were not meant to be disturbed, that the ceremony was a sacred part of British tradition, and that the people involved had a role to play in maintaining that tradition. As the ceremony began, the guard started to move. The tourist quickly raised their camera to capture the scene, snapping picture after picture. The guards were marching in perfect unison, their boots echoing on the pavement in time with each step. The movement was sharp, precise, and absolutely captivating. The tourist was so caught up in the excitement of the moment that they didn't notice how much closer they had gotten to the guard again. They were standing right next to the guard now, within arm's reach, their camera clicking away furiously. The guard's face remained stern and unblinking, focused entirely on the task at hand. But the tourist, totally oblivious to the importance of what was happening, thought nothing of it. They were simply trying to capture the best shot. The guard's position was so commanding, so unmoving, that the tourist felt like they were part of some royal story, a fairy tale unfolding in front of them. Suddenly, a shift in the guard's posture caught the tourists' attention. They had moved slightly, not to give way but to signal a shift in how they were holding their position. The guard's stance was more rigid, and they were no longer just standing still. They were preparing for something important, something ceremonial. It wasn't just the normal procession anymore. This was the changing of the guard, and the tourist was standing so close, they could almost feel the intensity of the moment. Unaware of how they were disrupting the ceremony by standing too close, the tourist decided it was a perfect time for a selfie. They turned their camera toward themselves, with the guard in the background, still standing motionless and unfazed by the attention. With a smile, the tourist clicked the button on their camera, completely unaware that they were breaking the rule of personal space. They quickly glanced around, checking to see if anyone had noticed, but the guard didn't flinch, not even a twitch. Their job was simple: to stand still, to protect, and to keep everything in order. The tourist took several more pictures, each one getting closer to the guard, never realizing that with each step, they were stepping closer to crossing an invisible line. The guard's eyes, though fixed forward, seemed to follow the tourist's movements, his expression unwavering. He was part of a centuries-old tradition, something that could not be broken, and he was not going to allow any disruption in his role. But the tourist, still excited and thinking this was all part of the experience, didn't stop. They even asked a nearby tourist to take a picture of them with the guard in the background. The person taking the photo was more aware of the protocol, giving the tourist a hesitant look before snapping the picture. But the tourist, having been so caught up in their own world, didn't even realize the tension in the air. To them, this was all part of the fun, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be so close to the royal traditions. But the guard was not there to entertain, to pose for pictures, or to be part of any tourist's experience. He was standing at attention for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with the excitement of the crowd. As the ceremony continued, the guard, still standing rigid and unyielding, took a small step forward. The tourist, not understanding the significance of that step, continued to stand there, snapping photos, getting closer, and edging toward the guard. The guard shifted again, this time much more noticeably, but the tourist thought it was just a part of the display. Finally, the guard took one more step, his eyes moving towards the tourist. It wasn't a threatening gaze, but it was unmistakable, a signal that the personal space the tourist had been intruding upon was no longer acceptable. The tourist didn't catch it at first. They simply smiled and waved at the guard, thinking that it was just a ceremonial gesture, but the guard's look said otherwise. There was no smile on his face, no gesture to acknowledge their presence. It was time for the tourist to move along. The crowd around the tourist had started to murmur, some shaking their heads, others glancing at the guard to see if any further steps would be taken. But the guard didn't act further, standing tall and unmoving. He had done what he was trained to do. He had made his position known. The tourist, unaware of the seriousness of the situation, snapped one final photo and slowly backed away. As the tourist moved to rejoin the crowd, they couldn't help but chuckle to themselves. It had been a fun experience, a little uncomfortable, but funny. They never once considered how close they had come to breaking the unspoken rules of royal tradition. But as they walked away, they could feel a strange awareness creeping in. It was like something had shifted. The energy of the crowd had changed, the guard's posture had changed, and even the air felt different. But to the tourist, it was just another exciting adventure in the life of a traveler. The next day, the tourists found themselves back at Buckingham Palace. London had so much to offer, but there was something about the grandeur of the palace and its royal history that drew them in. After visiting several other attractions, they had made a mental note to return for one last look at the palace, this time hoping to get a closer, more personal experience. It was early in the morning, and the streets were less crowded than they had been the day before. The tourist had learned a bit more about the traditions and history of the place, from the guidebooks and online articles they'd read the night before. They now understood that the king's guard was no ordinary group of soldiers, and that they had an important, serious job to do, protecting the monarch and preserving centuries of tradition. Still, the excitement of the city and the energy of the tourists around them made the tourist eager to witness the changing ceremony once again. They had seen it the day before, but they wanted to get a better spot this time, a clearer view of the soldiers in their uniforms, the precision of their movements, and, of course, the famous hats. As the tourist approached the gates again, they could see the usual crowds beginning to form. Tourists from all over the world were gathered, and there was a sense of eager anticipation in the air. People were pointing at the guards, taking pictures, and discussing what would happen next. But today, there was something different about the atmosphere. The guard who had caught the tourists' attention the day before was back at his post, standing perfectly still, his eyes forward and his expression unreadable. He was still, almost like a statue, his presence commanding respect, even if people didn't always understand why. The tourists joined the crowd once more, but this time, there was a slight shift in their awareness. They had learned a little about the importance of the king's guard and the expectations around them. Still, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something crucial the day before. The guard who had been so unyielding in their presence had not moved, not even a fraction, as the tourists stood too close. Was this normal, or had they crossed a line without realizing? The tourists didn't have time to dwell on it. The ceremony was about to begin. The guards started marching in unison, their heavy boots striking the ground with perfect rhythm. The crowd fell silent for a moment, captivated by the precision and formality of the event. Each movement was calculated, deliberate. The guards marched in sync, every step precise, as if they were part of a grand military dance. The atmosphere became almost reverential as people watched in awe, capturing every moment with their phones. But the tourist this time was more aware. They kept their distance, though they still wanted to get a good view and a few more photos. As the guards passed by, the tourist clicked their camera, trying to get a shot that would do justice to the magnificence of the ceremony. But even with the knowledge they had gained about the guards' importance, they couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. They moved closer again, hoping to get a better shot. Before they knew it, they were within arm's reach of the same guard they had interacted with the day before. They hadn't meant to get so close, but they were drawn in by the excitement of the ceremony, by the desire to capture the moment. The guard, though still standing perfectly still, seemed to sense the tourist's presence before they even reached him. It was as if the guard could feel the change in the air, the shift in attention. As the tourist moved closer, they saw the guard's eyes flicker slightly. The look was subtle, but it was there, an almost imperceptible change. The guard's face remained stoic, but there was a slight tension in his posture now, a hint of something more than just the usual focus on his duties. The tourist didn't notice this at first. They were too focused on getting a perfect photo, too wrapped up in their desire to capture this grand moment. Just a few more pictures, the tourists thought to themselves. I'll move away after this, I promise. But the guard wasn't going to wait for them to make that decision. He moved just slightly, his feet shifting in an almost imperceptible way, enough to show that he was aware of their presence, that he had noticed their proximity. His eyes, still fixed ahead, seemed to lock onto the tourist's, and for a brief moment there was a silent understanding between them. The tourist, still not fully realizing the gravity of the situation, took another picture, moving even closer to get the perfect angle. That's when it happened. The guard, in one swift and deliberate movement, stepped forward, not to march in his ceremonial dance, but to make his presence clear. He was no longer just a silent figure in the background. he was engaging with the tourist. The movement was subtle, but the message was loud and clear. "You are too close, step back." The tourist froze for a moment, the camera still in their hands. They hadn't expected this response. In fact, they hadn't expected any response at all. The guard had never acknowledged their previous actions, but now it was clear that their behavior had not gone unnoticed. The crowd around them had gone silent, as if they too could sense the shift in the guard's stance. The atmosphere became tense, and the tourist felt a surge of embarrassment rise up inside them. Realizing that they had crossed a line, the tourist quickly took a step back, their heart racing. They had been so focused on capturing the perfect shot that they hadn't stopped to think about what was happening around them. The guard had given them a clear warning, and now it was time to respect that. The crowd, still observing the interaction, seemed to release a collective breath. The guard remained calm and composed, not showing any emotion, but the message had been made loud and clear. The tourist, feeling the weight of the moment, lowered their camera. They had learned something important that day, not just about the traditions of the palace, but about respect. Respect for the soldiers who stood at attention, day in and day out, and respect for the role they played in maintaining the dignity of the monarchy. The ceremony continued, but the tourists' experience had changed. They no longer saw the King's Guard as simply a part of a tourist attraction. They were a symbol of discipline, tradition, and responsibility. The next time they would see a guard, they would do so with a newfound respect, knowing that there was more to these soldiers than just their impressive uniforms and their silent stance. The tourists didn't linger much longer. They moved away from the gates, their mind racing with what had just occurred. They had been so caught up in the excitement of the day before, in the rush of capturing the perfect photo, that they hadn't taken the time to understand the weight of the moment. But now, as they walked away from the palace, they couldn't help but feel a little wiser. London, with its history and traditions, had taught them a valuable lesson about respect, one that they wouldn't soon forget. The following day, the tourist woke up feeling a bit different about their time in London. The previous day's experience at Buckingham Palace had stayed with them, and as they reflected on it, they realized something important. They had learned more than just the history of the palace or the changing of the guard. They had learned about respect, respect for traditions, for the people who uphold them, and for the importance of following rules, even when they seemed invisible at first. It wasn't that the tourist had meant any harm the day before. They hadn't known the significance of the King's Guard, or the precise role they played in maintaining order and dignity for the monarchy. But now, after their second encounter, they understood better. The guard's movements, so deliberate and purposeful, were part of something much bigger than just a tourist attraction. It was a tradition that had been carried out for centuries, with strict rules that were never to be broken. The moment the guard had stepped forward to signal to the tourist to back off had been a powerful reminder of that. Today, the tourist was determined to make the most of their last day in London. They had a list of things they wanted to see, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they needed to do more than just sightsee. They wanted to learn. They wanted to understand the places they visited, not just photograph them. This realization gave their trip a new sense of purpose. After a relaxing breakfast at a small cafe nearby, the tourists set off for their first stop of the day, the Tower of London. The iconic castle, rich with history, was just as impressive as the palace had been, and the tourists found themselves drawn to its ancient walls, its tales of kings and queens, and the historical significance it held in the heart of the city. But even as they explored the ancient fortress, their mind kept drifting back to the King's Guard. What had seemed like a harmless tourist moment the day before now felt much more significant. As the tourist wandered through the tower, they found themselves reading about the role of the British monarchy, learning about how the Guard protected the royal family, their role in national ceremonies, and how their presence symbolized continuity and tradition. This deepened the tourists' respect for the traditions they had once viewed as just part of the tourist experience. After the Tower of London, the tourist went to the British Museum, another must-see attraction. Here, they marveled at the ancient artifacts, each with its own fascinating story to tell. But as they walked through the museum, they couldn't help but compare what they were seeing with their own experience. The museum held objects from many parts of the world, objects that had witnessed history unfold, just like the King's Guard had. The more they thought about it, the more the tourist began to appreciate how much history London held, not just in its grand monuments, but in its people and its traditions. Later in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the tourists found themselves walking back toward Buckingham Palace once again. They weren't going to try to get close to the guards this time. Instead, they had decided to take a moment to reflect on their experience. They were standing across the street from the palace, admiring the architecture and the beauty of the grounds, when they saw a group of tourists approaching the gates. One of them, a young man, was eagerly pulling his friends toward the guards. The group was excited, laughing, and clearly unaware of the protocols surrounding the guards. The tourist felt a little surge of awareness. They had been just like that, hadn't they? Eager, excited, and a little bit oblivious. But now, seeing the young tourists approach the guards, they could sense the potential for another misunderstanding. They couldn't help but think about how their own actions had been received the day before. The thought crossed their mind. Would they have made the same mistake again if they hadn't been given that firm, but silent, reminder from the guard? The young man, much like the tourist had been, was getting closer to the guards, trying to take photos without really considering the rules. The tourist's instincts kicked in. They knew what was about to happen, and they didn't want the same thing to unfold again. Stepping forward, the tourist casually approached the group of young travelers and offered a friendly piece of advice. "Hey," they said, "just a heads up. The guards don't like being too close to tourists. They're part of a tradition, and they're not here to be part of the photo op. It's best to give them some space." The young man looked at the tourist, slightly confused at first, but then he nodded, realizing the sincerity in the tourist's words. "Thanks," he said, and he signaled to his friends to move back a little. The group took a few steps back, still able to get a good view but respecting the space the guards needed to do their duty. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant to the tourist. They had learned something, and now they were able to pass that knowledge along. In a way, it was like a little piece of the lesson they had learned the day before had been shared with others. The guards' role, their importance, and the traditions they represented had become clear to the tourist. And now, they were helping others to see that too. As the group moved away, the tourist stood there for a few more moments, reflecting on how far they had come since the previous day. What had started as an innocent and slightly careless interaction had turned into a deeper understanding of respect, history, and tradition. It wasn't just about taking pictures or experiencing the sights. It was about connecting with the culture, understanding the significance of the places you visited, and appreciating the rules that kept those traditions alive. The moment was a turning point for the tourist. They realized that travel wasn't just about sightseeing. It was about learning, adapting, and respecting the places you visited. London had taught them that lesson, and it wasn't a lesson they would forget. The next time they encountered something new, they would approach it with a greater sense of awareness and respect. And perhaps, in turn, they would be able to pass on that lesson to others, just as they had done earlier that day. As the sun set behind the palace, casting a golden light across the grand structure, the tourist felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had come to London seeking adventure and excitement, but they were leaving with something far more valuable: a newfound respect for the city, its traditions, and the people who upheld them. It was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their travels, one that would shape the way they approached every new place they visited. The tourists' last day in London had arrived, and the city had started to feel more like home than a place to simply visit. They had walked through the iconic landmarks, enjoyed the rich history, and taken in the beauty of the city. But it was the lesson learned at Buckingham Palace that would stick with them the most. As they packed their bags and prepared for the journey back, they reflected on how far their perspective had shifted since they first arrived. The day before, they had wandered the streets of London in a carefree, almost oblivious way. They had been just like any other tourist, excited, eager, and more focused on capturing perfect photos than understanding the deeper meaning behind the places they were visiting. But that had all changed after the encounter with the King's Guard. It wasn't just about standing still for a photo anymore. It was about understanding the significance of tradition, the unspoken rules of respect, and how those rules connected people to history. As the tourist boarded the train to Heathrow, they felt a sense of accomplishment. Their trip had been full of experiences, but this was the one that had truly made them grow. London, with its grand palaces, historic landmarks, and deep-rooted traditions, had taught them a lesson they would never forget. On the flight back home, the tourist couldn't help but reflect on how they had changed. They thought about the young group of tourists they had spoken to the day before, how they had offered advice to them just as they had once received an unspoken lesson from the King's Guard. It was strange. Something so simple had made such a deep impact on them. The guard had never spoken a word, but in their silent, unyielding presence, they had taught a lesson about respect and understanding that would stay with the tourists long after they left London. When the tourists returned home, they shared their stories with friends and family. They talked about all the exciting things they had seen: the Tower of London, the British Museum, and of course, Buckingham Palace. But the story that stuck out the most wasn't about the buildings or the monuments. It was about the moment when they had realized how much they didn't know. They talked about how they had almost ignored the guard the way everyone else had, only to be taught a lesson in the most unexpected way. Their friends listened with curiosity, asking questions about the King's Guard, their role in the monarchy, and why they were so important. The tourists shared what they had learned, explaining how the guards weren't there to entertain or pose for pictures, but to symbolize something much larger: tradition, duty, and honor. It felt good to pass on this knowledge, just as they had done for the young tourists in London. The tourist realized that, in a way, they had become a part of that tradition, not by wearing a uniform or standing guard, but by respecting what the guards represented and sharing that respect with others. But it wasn't just their friends who were interested in the story. The tourists began to notice that when they told people about their trip, they could see a shift in how others viewed them. It wasn't about being a tourist anymore. It was about being a traveler, someone who understood the significance of the places they visited and the customs that defined them. People were no longer just interested in the photos the tourist had taken or the souvenirs they had brought back. They were interested in the story, in the lesson learned, and in the respect for tradition that had come from an unexpected encounter. The tourists found themselves thinking about their future travels differently. Instead of rushing through a checklist of places to see, they realized that the most important part of travel wasn't just about what you could see, but what you could understand. Every place had its own story, its own history, and its own set of rules. Whether it was standing before a centuries-old palace or walking through a bustling street market, the tourist realized that every moment was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to show respect for the culture they were experiencing. As the tourists started planning their next adventure, they couldn't help but smile. They knew that every trip from now on would be approached with a deeper sense of awareness. They would still take pictures, of course, but they would also take the time to learn about the places they visited, the history behind them, and the traditions that had been passed down for generations. And most importantly, they would always approach each new experience with respect, just as they had learned from the king's guard. Months passed, and the tourist's story became one that they shared often. It was a story not just about London or the king's guard, but about how travel had the power to change you. It was about understanding that the world wasn't just about looking at things through a lens or snapping a perfect shot. It was about seeing the world with respect, with an open mind, and with a willingness to learn. And while the tourist had seen many incredible sights in London, it was the silent, unyielding figure of the guard that had taught them the most. It had been a lesson in the quiet power of tradition, in the importance of respect, and in the understanding that sometimes the most profound experiences come not from what is said, but from what is felt in the silence. Years later, the tourist would still remember that trip to London, and they would still share the story with anyone who would listen. But now, when they told it, they would always end with one simple piece of advice. When you travel, don't just see the sights. Understand them, respect them, and never forget that every place has a lesson waiting for you.